Our disability is our greatest strength. It gives us the supervision to see the issues facing humanity from a more inclusive perspective and the grit to fight back against all odds. Welcome to Super Adaptables, the More Than Walking video podcast discussion. Welcome to Super Adaptables, the podcast where people of all abilities gather to discuss pressing issues that affect the disability community and their implications for the world at large. We are your host. I am Corey Pheez Lee, C4 complete quadriplegic since 2005.
And I am Jonathan Sigworth, C7 complete quadriplegic since 2006, both of us hailing from the great state of Connecticut.
Yes, sir. And we are recording this on Thursday, the 17th of April, 2025. And in a little bit, we'll be discussing with some experts about education, delivering for students no matter where they are.
And just as a reminder, Super Adaptables is made possible in part by a grant from the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation's National Paralysis Resource Center. The information provided and opinions expressed in these podcasts do not necessarily reflect the views of the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. For more information about the Foundation's National Paralysis Resource Center, visit www.christopherreeve.org. Also, I should note that the views expressed on this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of More Than Walking either, but belong to all of us as individual speakers.
Yes, and today we have several special guests joining us, beginning with Karma Quick Panwala. She is the Director of Children and Family Advocacy / Parent Training and Information Center for the Disability Rights, Education, and Defense Fund, or DREFT. DREFT is a nonprofit that focuses on advancing the civil and human rights of people with disabilities through legal advocacy, training, education, and public policy and legislative development.
We also have Eileen Healy, the Executive Director of Independence Northwest, and her colleague Tom Wade, an independent living advocate, and a former high school teacher who taught in Bridgeport and other urban areas in Connecticut for 30 years. More Than Walking is currently working with Independence Northwest to get the word out here in Connecticut about social safety nets and how we can improve and sustain them for the future.
Yes, and our fourth guest is Rodney Powell. Rodney is the principal at Woodland School in East Hartford, Connecticut, which serves students from K to 22. Rodney has been an educator since 1999 and has contributed extensively to the education system throughout Connecticut and Baltimore, Maryland.
And finally, we would like to introduce our last guest, Drew Martell. Drew has been a third grade teacher at Hebron Avenue Elementary School in Glastonbury, Connecticut since 2020. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here.
As we spoke privately, through email, telephone conversations, we're really having a discussion about the changes that have occurred at the Department of Education and how they are affecting not only local school districts, but just nationally, what's happening with different colleges and universities. And so, just a brief history lesson just on Jimmy Carter, because I know in our first opening introduction into this particular social safety net, this is exactly where the Department of Education came from. It came from Jimmy Carter's administration. And so on January 20th, 1977, Jimmy Carter, during his inaugural address, said this: "In this outward and physical ceremony, we attest once again to the inner and spiritual strength of our nation. As my high school teacher, Miss Julia Coleman, used to say, we must adjust to changing times and still hold to unchanging principles." And I found this quote fascinating personally because when Jimmy Carter became president, he was 52. And as there was no 12th grade during his time period, he graduated as a junior and at the age of 17. So why does that matter? It matters because after 35 years and after receiving so many accolades from his time spent in uniform to ultimately reaching the White House, he remembered the impactful words spoken by his teacher.
Yeah, our teachers have such an incredible impact on our lives. I remember my sixth grade teacher, Miss Wade, who got me interested in poetry and stories, and I carried that with me, through the rest of my life, studying as an English major in college and working on scripts, and now with More Than Walking, trying to share people's stories. Like, these impacts are huge. Additionally, a little fun fact about Jimmy Carter: while serving in the Navy, he was stationed right here in Connecticut as well. Amazingly, people and messages such as these sometimes come full circle, although we would rather it be under different circumstances sometimes. I think that what President Carter was alluding to the fact if you look deep into the inner workings of any nation, the mechanisms that keep the wheels of progress turning allow us to keep adapting to the change in times while remaining firm in our beliefs, beginning with barrier-free access to school and classrooms, reliable transportation for students with disabilities, opportunities for free meals or reduced lunch for low-income families, and reliable educators with a student first and politics last mentality.
Yeah, man. I couldn't agree with you more about that. I had the opportunity to run into one of my former teachers while my son was running track, and I expressed my gratitude to her for the mentor program that was running at the agricultural center at my high school. And it's because of her and those experiences why I'm a peer mentor today and work with advocacy because it's so important to be able to get the right message out to people. So, welcome again, everyone. And we're just going to jump right into our first question. So recently, there have been sudden changes being made at the Department of Ed, and it has many educators, parents, worried about what to expect regarding services and funding for both children and young adults with and without disabilities. What are you hearing at your work place, and how are you preparing for possible changes that may affect the community you serve?
I'm not quite sure how to answer this. In general, and I will say, as an individual that works with independent living, I don't support the Department of Education moving special ed into Health and Human Services, who has never had really a role of providing education resources to folks with and without disabilities. And there's something that I bristle about it because it seems to be, well, we're going to combine everything that's disability related and we're going to shove it all into Health and Human Services. And that worries me because part of what we as independent living folks do is we want to see services integrated in throughout. So we were in the Department of Ed. It was part of the general education. Whether you had a disability or not, it was integrated there. Um, and this may be a little political, but if you've seen the recent comments made by the new Secretary of the Health and Human Services regarding autism, um, that worries me that that kind of a mentality of people can't do anything, they can't hold jobs, they can't do X, Y, and Z, they can't be taxpayers. I think he led with that. Um, we don't want that mentality in providing any sort of disability service. We want to encourage people to be included, to be as independent and as they can and want to be, and provide the appropriate supports to get them there, and to make some assumptions about individuals' ability, whether it's autism or other disability, coming from Health and Human Services, I think is very scary.
Hmm. Yeah, that lack of expertise and experience handling things that really need, people who have experience with those things, lived experience, professional experience, who know what they're talking about. Um, Things are not just interchangeable for sure. Tom, your thoughts?
What I did when I was looking at the questions, I actually ran them over with a friend of mine who's got 40 years in, um, both as an English teacher and a guidance counselor in Bridgeport, and another person, another English teacher. And with the first question, what are the things that we're talking about? All of us were talking about is that there is clearly going to be less monitoring and guidance for Pell Grants, for example, and especially someone like Jim, who's been working with seniors for years. I mean, kids need Pell Grants. The money that helps them get into college with having to take very little to no loans, depending if they go to a community college or not. But there's also Title I, where you have low income areas receive federal funds to help pay teachers, purchase supplies, but for those students who have low reading scores, math scores, science scores. And so you actually get teachers who are hired to work with those students and teachers, classroom teachers, one on one. And I know in Bridgeport, a lot of those positions have already been eliminated. So, I mean, who knows what the future is going to bring. Um, One of the other things we were talking about was that special ed grants, including, that are included in Title I, there could be incredible delays and hopefully a lot of the programs and resources are not going to be eliminated.
I mean, how Eileen and Tom, how are you guys at a Center for Independent Living preparing for those possible changes, or is there anything you guys can do on that side of things?
Well, I think that we can do our best to advocate and educate the public, parents, students, as to what their rights will continue to be to have educational resources for students with disabilities and those without disabilities. Centers have traditionally been in going to IEPs and getting involved in that level. I think it's a question of getting schools and parents together and getting involved in school boards that impact their local school. Because part of the problem, as Tom was referring to as Title I, is that's great, but it's still not enough for some of our towns and cities that aren't as wealthy as other towns and cities. So the support from the federal government becomes really important, and figuring out ways to get more of those dollars and seeing the value in those dollars, and ensuring that students with disabilities have access to adequate resources and education is really important, and it's costly.
Yeah, I think you're spot on about that. You mentioned something key that I Drew, and maybe you could elaborate a little bit later about this thing about wealth disparity, right, between one
Yeah.
group of individuals versus the next. And when there isn't enough funds and resources, especially when it comes down to, access to the internet, broadband, et cetera, things of that nature, even like during COVID, it's like, okay, every kid did not have a laptop in the home. Every child did not have adequate internet and broadband reception so that they could keep up with the pace of the classroom. So, but we could get to that a little bit later. Rodney, what are you hearing at your place of work?
Well, I echo the sentiments of those who went before me. There's certainly a lot of fear of the unknown, kind of shock and awe at some of the decisions that are being made, and parents, and especially teachers, feeling uncertain about the future. I tend to be one of those people who starts with wants to grow with the people out rather than withering um, from the pressure from the outside in. And so what I mean by that is, in terms of the preparation piece, I think increasing capacity of those who do work with young people through resourcefulness, increasing their sense of resourcefulness by connecting with the community, by connecting with parents. I'm one of those people that if I can get it free, or if I can trade you for it, I'd rather do that than buy it. And I think that really applies to, what would we do if we didn't have this pot of money, right? Is there a way around it? Is there a different way to get it done without that existing? And I think that comes through people power. And the more people who are involved in schools and programs, especially those that serve students with disabilities. My school is 98, 99% students with IEPs. We can't just stop services. We can't just rely on those who are willing. We need those who are willing and equipped. And if we know we're not getting that from the federal government, I think in Connecticut we'll probably still be pretty good in terms of the way the state might manage things, and so we'll be lucky in that way. But I do think we need to increase our resourcefulness, those are the moves I'm making. I also echo the sentiments of those who say get involved. I'm feeling much more apt to get involved politically, attending a lot more meetings and things like that, and trying to bring others with me, because you can't sit there and get hit by the train that you see coming.
Mm, that's well said. And I think, what you're saying too is correct. I mean, we've been seeing throughout the news, if you're, following along and keeping track, there's a lot of angry people at these town halls. And they're angry at both sides, right? Like, because they want to figure out, okay, how is this going to affect me? Because there just seems to be almost like shoot it at a wall and let's see what sticks, right? And people are left in the dark and they can't really process that, which adds to the anxiety. And me and John had spoke about this, at length about children feel anxious at school. And if they're uncertain about, if their parents are uncertain about their future and their education, how are they going to be able to quell the fears that the kid already has when they're nervous about taking the test, right? And needing that extra time. And this is why things like 504 plans and IEPs are in place to match where that child is learning. But Drew, tell me about some of the things like in your district, what you guys have been maybe discussing.
I work in a one of a pretty wealthy district. Um, like needless to say, I still had parents, some of the parents in my classroom, and the parents in the district that were worried and had some fears based on what the new administration is trying to do or is attempting to do in terms of getting rid of the Department of Education. Um, they're worried about how the impact that it could have on their children. Um, but the superintendent and the director of equity and inclusion sent a message to the teachers, sent a message to the parents, stating that those changes from the federal level will not have any effect on the staff in terms of in the special ed department. It won't have any effect on the students. So any services that are provided with students with 504 plans and IEPs should not be affected. So the superintendent wanted to basically put to rest any fears or anxieties that the parents may have. So
Big
I know
deal.
Corey was talking about um, I worked at CREC prior to working in Glastonbury, and it's like night and day in terms of the resources that students in the special that are receiving services this from the special ed department. They have unlimited amount of resources in the town I work in. So the disparities are huge between the two towns.
True, excuse me, what school system are you working in?
Glastonbury,
Okay, thank you.
no problem.
If I could jump in just really quickly, regardless of where the Department of Education and its divisions end up, there are still multiple laws on the books that would need to be adhered to. And that's something that we get caught between funding and laws and rights. We need to make sure that we understand that doesn't lessen and take away the rights, at least not yet. It doesn't.
Yeah, that's a really important point that we both need to practice resilience, resourcefulness, but also like these are not optional. We can demand them because everyone with a disability deserves the right to education. Karma, and this is kind of your focus, right? Is advocating for children and families affected by disability. What are you hearing?
Absolutely. And again, everything that has been said far, I applaud my colleagues on this panel. It's great to hear all of you coming out and really forcefully saying how important this is and how much we really need to be reaching out to the families that we're supporting, the students that we're supporting. But I want to draw our attention to three things. And first of all, as many people have said already this afternoon, um, there are laws in place. And there's a way that all of our laws work. An executive order itself does not close a department that was founded through legitimate laws by Congress. So just because an executive order was issued that says we're going to close the Department of Education, really, that's the beginning of their attempt to close the department. It does not, in and of itself, do anything. So we need to remember that only Congress can close the Department of Education. A second thing I want to touch on is that while we, as of right now, have not done anything to the Department of Education itself, there's an office that's nationwide across the department called the Office for Civil Rights. And as many people here have already touched on, things like 504, the IDEA, and even the Americans with Disabilities Act, which Title II of that law applies to all of our public schools and colleges and universities, we have lost a significant number of staff in the Office of Civil Rights who actively investigate and complaints on civil rights laws within the field of education, whether it's Section 504, the ADA, whether it's Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, or any other civil rights law, Title IX even, that's protecting the rights of all of our students, both disabled and non-disabled in our schools. I do want to call out the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates and the National Center for Youth Law, who are addressing this issue in the courts right now. And we at DREDA are following that case very closely. We want to make sure that we're also taking a look and considering where else can parents and students go to get some of these issues resolved. Like if someone is being discriminated against on the basis of disability at their school or in their college and university, where can we go to remedy that? I mean, oftentimes there are uniform complaints that can be filed within the school districts, but what's another enforcement mechanism from the federal government if we don't have OCR? We're looking to see what's out there, who can we partner with, what other organizations doing similar work can we, find that alternative for enforcement for. And then finally, I want to touch on something that Eileen said earlier on that I think was really important. When we take anything disability related from the Department of Education and we move it into the Department of Health and Human Services, we are essentially taking something that has been to this day what we call the social model of disability, where people with disabilities get to be in the community of their choice and live as independently as they can and want to, as Eileen said, and actually have a voice at the table. Nothing about us without us, right? We take all of that and we put it into health and human services. That's the medical model of disability. And that actively disrupts our ability to live in the community that we want to live in and that we can live in. And it will just further increase the risk of institutionalization and warehousing and segregation, especially for people with disabilities in our society. And so many of us are trying to figure out, and again, find those ways, be creative, make sure that all of our parents and families and students with disabilities know their rights. I work for a parent training information center, so we're trying to get this information to the people that we serve through trainings and tabling and outreach. We are also trying to work with our protection and advocacy centers. Every state has one parent training center and at least one protection and advocacy center. So we're asking a lot of people to reach out to a lot of those resources and also working within the schools, get involved with parent groups, because when you find affinity within your community, that affinity means so much more and it really helps all of us be strong together when we've got to move forward against the potential elimination of our rights.
Wow, yeah, that's such an important observation that I did not catch on. That the social model to the medical model, that is huge, and the implications being that our disabilities, which are something my wheelchair I consider a part of my body. I don't see myself as chronically sick, and the idea that all of a sudden the whole framework by which vocational rehab or efforts to get people with disabilities into education or the workforce are all of a sudden viewed from that perspective is very disturbing to me, and should disturb all of us. So thank you for mentioning that. I want to move on to our next question, where we've already discussed and thrown out a couple of specific ways that the federal government supports education. Kind of want to list those out and explain them in broad detail before kind of going more into the fine details of things. But I guess, Eileen, let's start with you. What role generally does the federal government play in supporting education opportunities for students with and without disabilities? The whole gamut from elementary to post-secondary and beyond.
My understanding is that the federal government can create policy and direction, much like many of you will probably remember the No Child Left Behind initiative from the early 2000s, which becomes another piece of legislation now. But the idea that you want to set standards for achievement, those kinds of things, that's their overall kind of federal guidance, and others may have other input on that. But usually the other kinds of things are more done at the local and the state level.
there's funding for specific populations, students with disabilities, Title I, low income. There's the civil rights piece, the access piece, right? Making sure that folks aren't being discriminated against.
Right.
And then there's research and monitoring of kind of national trends about education. I know we'll talk about curriculum, but that is not one that they create. And so I think that's another part of the whole resistance and advocacy is understanding what can be done, what really has already happened or what hasn't. And what role, like this question is asking, what role does the government actually play? Because that gives you a clearer focus on where to get involved and who to form coalitions with. I don't think it's as broad as most people think. But there are very important pieces there. And like I think Karma said before, they can't just do whatever. That executive order is just a memo with a really nice pen. There's a whole group of people that get to make that decision, and we're included in that.
I mean, when I think of the federal government, I think there are three branches of government, right? And so while we're focused a lot on the Department of Education and what the Department of Education is doing in terms of the funding, the research, the enforcement of civil rights, things like that, I know we wouldn't have these rights if Congress didn't create them. And so Congress creates those rights. Congress also provides the funding. I mean, Congress has the funding power, right? So Congress can decide how it wants it's the money of the country to be used to support students and in education. It gets to decide some of the priorities that it wants to dedicate that funding to. And then the Department of Education basically adheres to a lot of those funding priorities. And, there's obviously room for movement and what have you. But the other thing I want us to all remember is that the courts can come in and also uphold the constitutionality and make decisions about what these laws can or can't do. Like, what are the extent of the rights under each of the laws? So we've, for example, even as of 2017, 2018, we had an expansion of rights in a sense in terms of clarifying what the IEP has to do for students with disabilities. What is the standard that school districts have to meet in terms of providing a free, appropriate public education? Students with disabilities have the right to, make very meaningful progress and to make progress in light of their unique circumstances, just like their non-disabled peers. So I like to see and think of our federal government is doing a lot of different things, but I will also emphasize it's not leading into the next question. It's not setting curriculum. It's not it's not doing any broad reach of the day-to-day experience of students teaching teachers and working on that. It's not determining the priorities of the subjects that are taught, for example. So I think it's important for us to remember that the federal government has a very its reach is more enforcement, and how do we decide we want at the federal level for some of this money to be spent? But again, the states themselves have a lot more discretion in what happens at the school day than the federal government does.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think, when we talk about like the myths associated with, I think the myth is the fact that the more that we talk about the Department of Education, I think it's opening people's eyes that they're using it almost like it feels like a tool to frighten people, right? But when you realize, okay, well, they don't have as much far reach and latitude. I'm more in power of it because I can attend those PTO meetings, right? I can get involved in the community as Rodney and Eileen had mentioned earlier, because that's really where the power relies in, is the people. But I think they're kind of in some ways circumventing a little bit, because knowing that they don't have the power to enforce what is going to be taught in schools. And they also are talking about, hey, listen, we're trying to give the power back to the states. Well, you're playing with state money. I
You're
just read
disempowering states.
well, yeah, exactly. Like, I just read an article by the AP, and I would love for Rodney to touch on it after I asked the question, but it said as a condition of receiving federal money, the Trump administration is ordering K-12 schools to certify that they're following federal civil rights laws and ending any discriminatory diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, right? So yeah, they can't influence the actual curriculum, but they can influence the money so that you can change your curriculum. And so that's really what it is. So, again, what are some of these common myths, not just what we're just discussing here, but others um, about the input about the federal government via the Department of Education has on curriculum? And can you help our listeners understand the structure of responsibility and management when it comes to ensuring student success from the federal level to the state to the town to the individual school systems? And we're saying run the gamut. We're talking about the Board of Education. We're talking about the PTO. We're talking about parent-teacher conferences, the teachers themselves. Like, what is that structure all about? And what are some other myths involved? And Rodney, I'd love for you to tackle that.
So again, the federal government up until, still now, provides funding and oversight of, different issues around access. But the states really decide on the framework for curriculum. It's not detailed. It's not meant to be. So it's the kind of the bones or the structure of the building for when it comes to curriculum. And then the towns may put additional requirements on in terms of how many credits and what they want students to be prepared for. But it comes down to, we can keep going down. The principals have, as a principal, I have some latitude in terms of what materials and what professional development I provide and what type of atmosphere and philosophy in order to get to those goals. But when it comes down to it, it's those teachers in the classroom have the most impact on how students are educated, right? How students feel in terms of inclusiveness, in terms of access. Whether or not they follow rules that harm students, or if they, create pathways that benefit students, even if it hasn't really been done before, because that's what that particular student or that particular class needs. And so again, it's the power of the people. The more specific, the more acute you get down into the classroom, really the more power you have. We don't believe that, though. We don't believe that. I have to counsel teachers all the time who feel like there's this invisible force that's affecting the way that they deliver curriculum. And I have to tell them that that is just not true. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. And Drew, being an elementary school teacher yourself, what are the myths or misunderstandings you're hearing from parents with their concerns, or the broader public about your role and what you have control over, what the federal government has control over, etc.
You guys, I'm pretty new in education compared to listening to you guys speak. I can tell you guys are really professionals and really good at your craft. I'm so great. I'm grateful to be able to hear the minds, like the great minds, speak about what's going on. So basically, like in our town of Glastonbury, because like you guys all said, it comes down to the state. And based on in our district, our state, I'm sorry, our district is not aligned or is not worried about what's going on with the Department of Education. The superintendent and a principal has assured the parents of children with disabilities that their child will be well cared for. The services aren't going away. The paras in our schools, they don't have to worry about the paras jobs being taken away. The tutors for our students that have IEPs, that's not going anywhere anytime soon. The only question I have for you, I know you guys were all talking about everything, that we have rights and everything comes down to the state level. But to my understanding, I know the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that was passed by, that's a federal law. So it's to ensure that students with disabilities receive a free, right, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. My whole worry is what happens to the states that kind of align themselves with the thinking of the new administration. What's going to happen to those students if they don't receive federal funding, if their school district
Hmm.
does not receive federal funding? Because it still brings me back. I know we're here talking about disabilities and IEPs and 504s, but it kind of still brings me back to like the Civil Rights Act. If that wasn't passed by the federal government, what would happen to people that were being discriminated based on race, color, religion, sex, and so on? What would happen if that act wasn't passed?
There's just going to be a disparity between, if we even get to that point. First of all, let's just keep that in perspective. If we get to the point where the states are deciding, there's going to be a disparity between, more left-leaning states and more right-leaning states. If you watch at the level of capitulation that happened with at the university level with Columbia versus what Harvard just said, Harvard basically just said, go kick rocks. There are states where the governors are like, go kick rocks, right? Because they know that right now the law is still behind the people, right? It's nothing has actually changed. But if we do get to that point, the raw truth is kids are going to be discriminated against and held back, and access is going to be limited in those states that kind of follow orders. But I think there's going to be such a big resistance, not only in the left-leaning states, because let's face it, families from across the aisles have students with disabilities, and so this is not by no means hard borderline.
I want to
Sure.
touch on something Rodney said in the previous question about equity. And it's like, if I'm not mistaken, one of the roles of the federal government is to oversee and make sure that there is equity in the educational system. Now, is it perfect? Absolutely not. We know that as firsthand knowledge. But that's a big role. It's a huge role. And as far as what's taught in the classroom, again, it's been stated that the federal government can say we need to go by the Common Core, so that may tell us what to teach, but how it's taught is up to the states, localities, primarily boards of education. Of course, unless you live in Florida, where the governor and the legislature has pretty much dictated, in many ways, what the local schools will teach or not teach, I should say. But that's all I wanted to touch on.
And if I can follow up with what Tom and Rodney and Drew were saying, is also my fear is that there is this whole DEIA and the types of things that the current administration is saying that they don't want to see states teaching, whether that's critical race theory, whether it's transgender issues. That sets up a real dynamic of parts of this country understanding, people's rights and perhaps the history as to how we got those rights from the states that are now saying they're not going to teach any of that, or they're going to whitewash it, for lack of a better word. And I think that's something it feels like a divide and conquer kind of thing.
It's definitely a scary situation. And for any vulnerable group, the best way to shorten our path to create barriers in our path to progress is to make us resentful of some other group, and we've seen that happen across history. So, so moving on, I do want to get to the meat of this. So, can we outline what are the different tools and programs? What is a 504? What is an IEP? What is an FAPE? How what do these things actually give to our communities? Why should we care about these?
So Section 504 is one of the first major disability rights focused and centered civil rights law. So it basically says that no one should be denied access or can be denied can be discriminated against on the basis of disability by the federal government or a federal contractor, anyone who receives funding from the federal government for any reason. So it applies to the federal government itself and then to anyone receiving federal funds. They cannot discriminate on a person on the basis of their disability. So that applies, it applies almost everywhere. And not exactly everywhere, but in so many parts of our lives. Schools, for example, since we're talking about education here, there is something created called the 504 plan, and there are regulations under 504 that are overseen and developed by the Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education, regarding how 504 applies in schools to support students with disabilities. Now, a 504 plan is essentially a document that lines out the different accommodations that will be provided to a unique student on the basis of their disability while they are at school. And it can be, for example, extra time on a test. It could be taking a test in a separate room. It could be having a fidget tool or a wobbly chair. It could be getting breaks as needed. It could be preferential seating in the classroom. For some students, depending on their disability, it could even be modifying the length of their school day. And to a small extent, we can also see some additional services brought in. For example, maybe you bring in some occupational therapy services to support the student who needs the wobbly chair or the fidget tools, for example, because those are things that an occupational therapist may do. So long story short, the 504 plan, as the 504 would apply to a public school, allows a student with a disability to access their education with accommodations in place. We are generally thinking that this is the general education classroom, and regardless of whether a student has a 504 plan or an IEP, which is very different from a 504 plan, we all think of disabled students as general education students first. So knowing that we're going to get to the difference between the 504 and the IEP in a bit, I do want to touch on the 504 lawsuit because this is something that is so important. 17 states, starting with Texas, filed a lawsuit at the end of last year, alleging that they should not have to basically implement 504 or adhere to 504 because of the addition of the gender dysphoria as a disability that was decided by the Biden administration in May of 2024. So these 17 states filed a lawsuit in Texas, and they are arguing a number of things. One of them, which was they wanted the courts to find Section 504 unconstitutional. Well, we have just received clarification very recently that some of the states are no longer arguing that 504 should be declared constitutional. But that being said, we still want to make sure that everyone with a documented disability, regardless of what that disability is, and yes, we want to include gender dysphoria in there too, because it is a disability, has access to the accommodations and the supports and the services they need under that law. So that is in a nutshell. And if any of you have anything to add on the 504 lawsuit, please feel free to chime in. The IEP, that's under the IDEA. And what we often say is Congress created the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. The IDEA created special education. Special education created the IEP. So the IEP is a list of documents, or it's a document that shows how a student with a certain set of disabilities who can be eligible under any 13 categories of eligibility, and one of them is even a catch-all called other health impairment, that students could be eligible under. It's sort of a catch-all provision. And we want to make sure that these students have equal access to not just the classroom, to academics and what have you, but education as a whole, their entire experience. So that means that if a student has difficulty communicating with their peers, we want to identify and make sure that we can see what areas of communication with the peers that student needs some support in. so that they can go to school and communicate with their peers, whether in the classroom or out on the playground or at lunch, or what have you, and be able to receive speech and language services to support them in being able to communicate with their non-disabled peers, just as they can communicate with everyone else. It's the same thing with related services. We can get support for students with their academics. For instance, if you have a student with dyslexia, you may have some goals for reading, and specifically things like reading fluency or reading comprehension. And a resource teacher may spend some dedicated time with that student, as laid out in the IEP document, to make sure that that student is making progress and sort of closing the gap from where our general education students are expected to be and where the curriculum is, and to where the student with the disability is. We want to close that gap. That's why we have these goals in the IEP to help students make that meaningful progress that I mentioned earlier. Close that gap, make progress in light of their circumstances, just like their non-disabled peers. So all of that together is supposed to provide access to education as a whole, access to the general curriculum, access to being with their non-disabled peers, access to their environment, even because the school environment is very different from the home environment and the community environment. And we have all of these laws from Section 504, the ADA, and the IDEA that really wrap around and support our students with disabilities and make sure that they have access, the access and equity they need to fully participate in life and society.
Thank you so much for that, Karma. So in a nutshell, 504 is focused on accommodations. This is an overly simplified version, and the IEP is really kind of helping equip people with the skills and the accommodations to engage in all environments in the classroom and outside, like throughout their lifetime.
I always think of 504 as, the 504 means that I can get into the classroom as a wheelchair user, or, up and down an elevator or whatever it might be. So it takes away barriers, where the IEP, is a whole different critter. It's about 13 pages longer.
One of the most important parts of the IDEA and an IEP that really ties, primary, secondary education into life after school is the transition plan. There's actually a requirement in there that school districts help students with disabilities who have IEPs prepare for life afterwards and look at, what is reasonable and appropriate for that student, what education, if any, might look like after high school or after they finish a transition program, what employment, if any, whether it's volunteer work or technical work or professional work, might be reasonable and appropriate or interested for that student after high school. And then also independent living goals. Do they need to learn transportation? Do they need to learn how to drive? Do they need to develop a budget, or figure out what the cost of living is and figure out where they want to live? So that's a really important part of it too, that ties into this bigger picture of what the federal government can do for students with disabilities and people with disabilities as they move from their education into living in society as they wish.
And I'll expand on that, Karma, just a little bit, because vocational rehabilitation also is funding transitional services in terms of vocation. And just for historical purposes here, vocational rehab is under the Office of Special Ed and Rehab Services, otherwise known as OSERS, which is under the Department of Education. So that's another one that is being questioned as to where that might shake out. That might end up in the Department of Labor. Okay. Again, we don't know what all of that's doing, and Karma's comments are absolutely right. We're trying to predict what this administration is going to do, but a lot of what they say they want to do, they really can't without congressional support and oversight on how we do that. The other thing I want to point out here is that the student loans are the largest item of budgetary within the Department of Ed. And that's student loans for going to college, higher education. People need that. Sadly, so many people, whether they have a disability or not, are working paycheck to paycheck, trying to pay off student loans. So that's a big problem. The free and reduced lunch, I believe, is under the Department of Agriculture. So there's lots of pieces here that seem to all kind of fit a little bit. Vocational rehab typically doesn't start much before 14. And in some places it's closer to 16, where they're working with the schools to better prepare a student that has an interest in going to work, to be able to get some work experiences. I think that there's a lot that can be done under transition that would better improve an individual's ability for living independently in the community of their choice. And that's something that really does need to be talked about from the time that kids are really young, and getting the idea that kids can be self-sufficient, that you start to teach those things at the appropriate age level. But yes, you can make some decisions for yourself. You can participate in your 504 plan. You can participate in your IEP as a student. So those are things to empower individuals to be able to participate. And there's lots of resources out there. Sometimes it kind of gets a little convoluted how you get to all of it and how they all interact together.
Yeah, no,
Abs-
I think that's correct. There's a way to see how they complement one another. And ultimately, we want to make sure that it ensures student success at the end of the day, and that student can feel confident when they leave, that classroom setting in his or her ability to be able to contribute to society. But like just on the ground, um, just from our educators, how have you seen the implementation of these programs change people's lives or support your work as a professional? Regardless if you have in-depth experience with the IEP or 504, just I would even broaden it to say, just how have you seen the impact of what you're doing every day on kids?
My entire career has been working with students with disabilities, or the alternative space where the student may not be identified, but that's through a failure of the system and not because they didn't qualify. And what I've seen is students graduating from high school that wouldn't have had a chance without these programs, students getting employment who wouldn't have had a chance without these programs, students getting into post-secondary education, uh, who wouldn't have had access before. And I think, just working in this space for so long, the amount of understanding that I have about the learning process, and those my colleagues have about the learning process, and what it takes to get students to be able to reach their goals is extremely extensive and detailed. And that's because of the ability to interact with all of these tools that are designed to help people, to help level the playing field.
Thank you for that, Ronnie. Drew, how have you seen these programs change people's lives in the classroom?
Well, speaking from a third grade, perspective, third grade teacher perspective, I've with all these supports that are put in place for my students that have 504 plans, that have IEPs. I've just seen self-esteem and confidence improve in my students. They feel capable. They feel like it kind of like levels the playing field for them in the classroom. Like a student, I had a student last year who was diagnosed with dyslexia. Um, and I'd seen that student say, I can't do this, to at the end of the year saying, I can do this. Like, I seen the joy in that student's eyes, and those supports that were put in place to help that student be successful. And especially in an elementary school setting, those students, they express joy. It's in a different manner than I've seen in like the middle school or the high school level. So, you know, them receiving extra time on tests. Um, a lot of my students, they need, they benefit from proximity. So um, they're able to sit closer to me. They get more breaks. Some of my students that have ADHD, they have longer breaks than other students just besides recess. They get more breaks during long assignments. A lot of the students, the student I had last year who suffered from dyslexia, he had access to audiobooks. So he was able to had the same, he had access to the same information as the other students who didn't suffer from dyslexia. I'm able to modify, you know, the homework for those students. So they have the same material as their peers. So like I said, it levels the playing field and it supports them um, and it carries on with them so they can take those plans and the following teacher that they'll have the next year so they don't feel like they're behind. Now they feel like they're caught up with the rest of their peers.
It's so important that continuity and that ability to move forward to the next level, especially at such an early age, where, as you mentioned, like being close to the teacher, that being close to the teacher, just being able to interact at just this very human level, that's what, education is all about, learning, and that's what we're doing throughout all our lives, and just giving people the ability to do that without having to say, sorry, we don't have the funding to pay for that. Like, what a sad excuse. If we can't give each other the ability to just learn and grow. Karma, what have you seen?
As I've supported students with IEPs for a number of years, there are two specific students who come to mind. One is a student that I supported from somewhere in middle school to through his junior year of high school, and he was really struggling and in middle school, just wasn't in the right classroom for all the ways that he needed to access his education. And with a team effort, I was able to help him move to a different school that actually really met all of his needs. And I'm just gonna kind of, piggyback onto what was said earlier. You just watch their confidence and their self-esteem grow by leaps and bounds. Students who couldn't imagine really graduating from high school, didn't really understand, whether going to college or having a job was a possibility for them. All of a sudden, just being in the right educational setting with all the services and supports they need, the access to the teacher that is so important, just changing a few of those things through the IEP can really make a difference, not just in your access to the curriculum, your access to the teacher, access to the content. It makes a difference in their self-esteem and their thought process of what's going to happen to me after high school. Okay, you know what? Now I'm actually interested in computer science and I want to pursue, maybe a community college degree. And then if that goes really well, I'll, maybe look at going to a 4-year school and getting a bachelor's, and I want to have this kind of job and work in this environment. Things that particular student had not been able to articulate before he changed schools and changed learning environments. It is really kind of incredible how profoundly this a change in the IEP, once it really becomes that appropriate document that allows for that meaningful progress to happen, it can be a night and day difference in the lives of some students. There was another student I supported who had been almost misidentified in the process of getting an IEP and was made eligible for special education services under one category, and it really should have been like 2 or 3 other categories. There was just a lot that was missed, unfortunately, given the manifestation and a number of things going on. But once we got that student identified and again got him into a place where he can access everything he needs, the speech and language services, some really solid uh, structured literacy for dyslexia and that sort of thing, this kid is thriving. And I'm so happy to see that and to know that we have an actual tool with the IEP. Parents have the rights to participate and say, hey, wait a minute, I think we need to change something. And hopefully if the IEP team is listening, or if the parent is able to, bring people to that space who can really speak to the student and what they need, the team can work collaboratively to get the student the things that the student needs to really be able to, again, leave high school and have the kind of life that they want and that they can have, and that, you know, to the greatest extent is appropriate, and that they're able, those students can be independent in the way that is best for them.
We started working with a young man who has autism as he was finishing up high school. And he had lots of other issues, let's put it that way, but incredibly smart, incredibly talented young man. And we started working with him during the transition process. One of the things that, as that moved into vocational rehab, they placed him at Independence Northwest, our independent living center, as an on-the-job trainee to do IT. And I can't think of the word. You know what I mean. Uh, and he turned out to be wonderful at it. He was so skilled at it. We ended up hiring him long after the OJT ended. And over the years of working with him on some of the other things that probably would have gotten him maybe let go or fired, things like not taking a shower before work, not zipping up his fly before he came to the office, you know, those kinds of soft skills that become a problem for some. We worked with him on all of that. End of story. He's now the media specialist at a school in Maine, full time.
Wow.
So the opportunities are there if we can figure out what people want to do, what their interest is, and not kind of killing that dream of I want to do this, and let people learn through the process of learning about that job or that activity, whether it really fits for them or not. The best interview I ever had for someone who wanted to work for the center, we asked this individual what he would do if a young woman came to him using a wheelchair and she wanted to be an ice skater. And his response was, I'd figure out how to put skates on her wheelchair.
Mm.
That's what is important in figuring out how to work with kids, how to work with adults, and how do we accommodate people and have them do the things that are really important for them, because they'll excel at them.
Yeah, I believe that wholeheartedly. Cultivating the gift at the end of the day. Um, you know, most of us, you know, right, we're from a era where your parents tell you, listen, you got to figure it out. And, you know, I can't be there for everything. And to some extent, that is very true. But this is now a time period where, you know, some of us here who are parents, and most of us have all worked with children of some age, now they're learning to cultivate those gifts, and they're strengthening those gifts by the way that we help them reinforce what it is that they wish to do, what they desire to do, what they like, what their interests are, because we're coming alongside of them, and we're building this trust and this partnership with them. You know, from, you know, Drew, you're teaching very young children, third graders. I have a fourth grader, and I'm like, what do you want to do? I don't know. I just know Roblox, right? Like, you know, so it's up to me as his father. I have to sit there and try to figure out his strengths, his weaknesses, work with him in those areas so that when he gets to the place where he's walking out the door, like the young man in Eileen's situation, he's prepared. He knows what he wants to do, and then he can be able to excel in that field. You know, individual like Rodney, who's a principal overseeing students K through up to 22, it just means that the process doesn't stop just simply because you walk into adulthood. You may still have some skill sets that you have to work on, that you need more training, and that's okay. And this is why, you know, the Department of Education, the way that they implement policy, and the way that that policy is brought to a state, and the way that the state enforces their curriculum is key. That everybody, the community that we're trying to build together, has to be involved. And, you know, I'm thankful for, you know, someone like Karma, who is working with families to build that community, to strengthen them, to train them, because the work is a lifelong process. Your disability does not get cured. per se. You learn to live with it. You learn that though I have some sort of quote unquote deficiency in this area, I can find key areas that are applicable and somebody else can see that in me and hire me. So, what do we need in the meantime? A federal government that can provide oversight that helps with discrimination against employment. We need a federal government to ensure that the funds are there for those students with special needs to not only just get into the classroom, but to get to the school. Transportation needs to be provided, ramps, update the school accessibility points, egress points, so that those kids can feel safe, not just only to learn, but if there was something to happen, they can also know that they have a route to get out as well. And so, this has been such a great discussion, guys. I'm so happy that you joined us and stayed longer. But this conversation needed to be had for our viewers and for those who may or know somebody else who has a disability or a child with a disability. So thank you again for participating in our More Than Walking video podcast discussion.
Stay tuned in and sign up for the More Than Walking newsletter at morethanwalking.com to learn about the topic we will cover next and how you can participate. Also, if you are concerned about educational accommodations for disability, your rights, or you have a disability and you're interested in working or going back to school after a disability, there are resources out there. Contact your local Center for Independent Living. You could probably Google search it and find it. It's a national network, federally mandated network of nonprofits like Independence Northwest, where Eileen works, and Tom. So those resources are there to help you. We're also partnered, More Than Walking is partnered with spinalpedia.com to provide one-on-one mentoring to help you access education and employment resources in your area post spinal cord injury or other disability. So reach out to us. Also, like, comment, and subscribe to our More Than Walking YouTube channel to watch each podcast, and click that notification bell so you are alerted when each new episode drops. Follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for More Than Walking or Super Adaptables.
And until then, remain encouraged, stay hopeful, and above all else,
Keep adapting.